is Calin Segal. I'm an architect by trade. Actually, started also as a VJ in clubs and festivals since I was 16. So I've been working mostly with digital mediums. Now I'm mostly focused on generative art and interactive installations. Like throughout the years after I finished school, I have a series of projects that I've done in collaboration with my studio that I started, which is called Dialogue. So one of the first installations that we've done was, this was before we had VR. We were looking at experiences and how to do storytelling using video game software. We created this kind of imaginary world called Paradise Hills, where a series of surreal moments would happen that would put the player in a various state of mind. Afterwards, we created this performance using an EEG device that was recording the brain activity of the person and translating it into sound and projections. This is kind of the results that we're getting. So the more they were concentrated, the more the image would expand and create more connections. The more they were relaxed, the more it would focus towards the center and have a very low tone sounds. Binary deconstruction is one of the latest installations I've done. Actually, before coming here, I was in a residency in Rotterdam where I created this device that scans people's faces and translates them into sculptures. The idea was to kind of look at alternative ways of doing selfies. So it was also a way of looking at the gallery space as a fully a production space in which you would have the data harvester, the generator, and the manufacturer all in the same place. So the person, it's almost like an assembly line where the person goes through various stages and arrives at the end to have its own kind of unique sculpture. This is some of the results of the sculptures. This one was done at the Enric Miralles Foundation. It's an architecture foundation in Barcelona, where we were looking at the question, what does it mean to go from wherever geographically you are to the sky? So Path to Heaven is kind of an exploration of all the junk in space, because we realize that you never have a direct kind of path to space because of all the debris that are out there. It creates this kind of wavy lines. So we were exploring using this cartographer that had a magnetic device underneath that would move it. It would slowly kind of try to map out the path to heaven. Woodpeckers in the Urban Jungle, it's an installation where we usually, when we go to a new city, we gather all sorts of objects that create the tonality of that city and create a composition using those found objects. We created this frame that you can expand and contract depending on the location, and then we can place within this frame various elements. Cricket, it's also an exploration within the idea of clusters and how feedback loops can generate activity. So if each device has a microphone and a speaker in it, and as soon as the first one triggers, they all start communicating with them and creating almost the same sounds as crickets do. Waterflies was another installation where we were looking at how to create sustainable artwork. So those water mills try to calculate how much water is left on the planet and how long will it take us to utilize all the fresh water reserves. And then at the end of the day, when the water slows down, they forget what they've calculated, and at night, when the water speeds up again, they start recalculating the same information. And they were giving a light show and a sound show based on that every time they were finding the result. These are a series of sculptures that we created for various clients in which they would give us the data sets and we would try to interpret those data sets into sculptural objects. We always start with a monolith and then try to work our way through various techniques in shaping the overall geometry, topology, composition of it. These are some details from the sculpture. More series of exploring how to create sculptural storage devices. So this was another client. He gave us a series of data that we interpret them and created sculptures for them. This is one of the first experiments that I did here. Here I also played with the idea of the plotters. So this was from a family tree of a client that wanted to find an alternative way of representing all the connection between each member of the family. So we were playing around with like attraction fields and repulsion fields, with starting off with like one particle from the top representing each member of the family, and depending on how it related to the main family members, it would attract or disperse. This was one of actually the early experiments that I did, where I looked at desertification in Romania and how to kind of explain the amount of land loss we have because of agriculture practices, deforestation, and other factors. I also do live events where I tour around with other artists, musicians especially, and we have this performance called Benu, that it plays for like 45 minutes, and it explores like various ways of, like, it tries to put the audience in various states of mind, from very aggressive to calm, and we're always playing with like the emotions that we're transmitting. A theater performance where we were looking at how to have a digital actor next to a physical actor within the theater. So this was an AI that was trained on the dancers' movements, and throughout the performance, both of them would interact with each other. And what was interesting, it was because the AI was actually trained on the real human movements, it would kind of pick up on the rhythm, the tone that the dancer would set, and would try to follow his behavior. Stage design, this was one of the first ephemeral structure that I've designed. It was a structure that would fold in on itself or expand based on the brain activity of the people inside or the performers. Depending on how we would set it up, it will be either a stage for performance or more as a hangout spot at various festivals. More stage design examples. During the pandemic, we were one of the first ones to launch online gallery. We invited a bunch of friends together and gave them like a plot of land in our virtual space. We gave them, each had a little cube where they could create whatever they wanted. It slowly and slowly expanded to having a real-time audio-visual space where performance could stream in. And then at one point, it expanded to the point of becoming its own planet, in which we had permanent installations combined with stage performances, live feeds from people around the world transmitting data. We created this forest which would react to either the person or the sound of the performances. And we also made a video game in which kind of we explored the early days of cyberspace and what cyberspace means. And embedded in the video game is kind of the narrative of the early days of the internet, how people used to interact with it, and it goes into the story of this like massive entity that takes over cyberspace, and you have to figure out a way to free it and bring it back to its original form. I wanted to show you a bit my process. So the notion of encoding data into information started when I was with my brother. We were late that night at home, and we were trying to remember when we were kids how our parents used to put us against the door to record our height. So that object was kind of a totem in the house where you would have our whole childhood experience from when we were little to when we grew up. And we were a bit nostalgic because we moved to Paris later, and we kind of lost that piece of history, family history. And from there, I started thinking, like, what does it mean to have information stored in other formats than the digital format that we know today? So today we're kind of used to this file system, rigorous hierarchical data structures that you can only have it in a specific way, and it only gives you like real information. You have no space for interpretation or no ways of creating your own narrative for that information. But looking back in time, there are various ways of encoding information that was related to the object itself. So, for example, one of the early history of objects was to record the quantities or to record human activities in general. So here, for example, we have a bone that was found where each notch would represent a quantity of something. We don't know exactly what that quantity was because we lost the mechanism of decoding that information, but we know that they were able to have a relationship between the object and the information that was on it. Another interesting example is the quipu. It's an Inca way of storing information. They didn't have access to, they weren't using a written language or a numerical system like we were using. They were using knots and strings in base of 10 to store population data, harvest data, or other important numerical values that they wanted to remember. Another way of looking at objects and information was through, I never get this one right, mnemonic devices. So the ability, like for example, here a shaman within the community would take this board, which would be empty at the beginning, and start, while he was telling the story, start placing each bead to kind of symbolize either an event or landscape format or something that would help him emphasize the point of the story. There are other examples like tolly sticks that were used to encode information, in which a stick would be a single piece of plank. We would etch together the amount of money somebody would owe to each other. They would cut it in half, and one person would get one half, the other person would get the other half. And when the time was to pay the debt, the two pieces would have to match, and the notches had to align. The Aboriginals in Australia use also a way of representing landscape that is more about dreams and storytelling. So they find ways of abstracting natural landscape into geometrical compositions. The Five Nations in the Americans were closing their treaties using this kind of belts, in which one part of whoever signed the treaty would get half of the belt, the other one would get the other half, and depending on the number of rows, the number of beads, the story would be told. So what I'm actually concerned is not necessarily with kind of data visualization, but more how to look at the aesthetical properties of the objects and how to embed information in it. Like when we talk about aesthetics, we're talking about kind of more or less this process of how we decide if we like or don't like an object, right? We usually have 2 to 3 seconds to make up our mind if we're interested in something. And it creates kind of an interesting feedback loop between the way I design an object and the kind of emotional effect I want to have over that object. Like I have at my disposal a palette of choices where it's area, curvature, volume, projection. I have the aesthetical level that I'm interested in. Is it flat? Is it soft? Is it sharp? And then I also have the emotional level in which do I want to convey an aggressive, a warm, or a dynamic feeling. And all of this create kind of a feedback loop of decision-making process. So my idea of sculptural storage format is kind of based on this, how to control these parameters using real-life information. So how do I control the composition, the proportion, the materiality, and the space of the object itself? I don't want to get to a form of data visualization where everything is clear and you're able to understand the information. I want to be able to have space for interpretation, space for abstract thought. So if, for example, if we look at classical columns in various religious settings, we only see that the play between pattern, rhythmical, and hierarchy and progression tells the kind of story that the culture itself wants to project. So these are a series of personal examples using one of the algorithms I developed, in which I take a simple sentence like hello world, I convert it into a numerical value, and then I set those values in a 3-dimensional space. The totems that you saw earlier were kind of done in the same principle, in which I have a vocabulary of objects, that each represent a numerical value. So each totem then takes on different kind of meaning based on the information that I'm trying to encode in it. What I'm always looking at is trying to balance out between the system that can be completely random and can produce almost unbalanced composition and having an artistic control over those objects. Then usually I either print them in plastic, ceramics, aluminum, or steel directly. So yeah, sorry, missed the pattern. Oh, Pan is going to be doing a performance after this. So he prepared the patch using the synthesizer. I think you can talk to it about more.